Hello, everyone. We're getting there. Super stoked to have you all here today. Staging, as always, one of the most fun days of the quarter for me and for the team. Really stoked. Mila and Jillian are both here as well from our community team. So let's talk about it. I think probably the right way to frame the conversation is I really want to talk about cloud as it is today. I really want to frame the conversation in terms of this big idea, right? Like, how do we make the experience of cloud, the IDE in particular, but just cloud in a general way, like a place where folks, it's not just a tool to do transformation, it's also a place to improve as a professional. Because right now, and for a long time, I feel like you can't learn how DBT like within that interface. It's really challenging. Like, you've got to have other tabs open. There's other stuff you have to be aware of or be thinking about. So that's the mindset that I'm in. But I'm really open here to have whatever conversation y'all have on your minds, to be honest with you. And I wonder, Jillian or Mila, if y'all have any sense of what the broad shape is from the community and from what you've been hearing or thinking about.
Yeah, I'll jump in there just to start us off. I think one of the biggest, or rather most common things I've heard from folks in the community thus far is that the IDE, you're absolutely correct. It's very useful to the person who already knows what commands to use. It's always, if you're moving from the, the command line to the IDE, it's a pretty seamless transition, but it's hard to get started. And it's especially hard to learn in that context. There's a huge desire to see more auto completion of commands, and not just in the command line, but also folks want to see auto completion of their resources and whatnot, just to help them understand how their resources are fitting together in a project. So there's definitely a hunger to see more of that, the higher order functions of a fully integrated development environment.
Yeah, I so dig that. I think as a profession, the analytics engineer right now is a little bit on the hunt for the right tooling to be equal to the problems that they face. I think in some ways, as an industry, we've been really focused on the super like tangible and tactical work of the analytics engineer, which is do transformations in like a more accessible language, be closer to business needs. And I think we're now like starting to open a door or open a window into this much more strategic problem space, which is not just like literally transforming information, but like transforming the way that organizations think about and relate to their information. Because for a long time, all organizations have had this issue of what you might call manufactured uncertainty, right? Like, if I flip a coin, it's going to be heads or tails. I don't know which one. That's a naturally occurring uncertainty. Like, it just exists. It's observable. It's always going to be there. But as we come together as humans and try to build organizations and try to maintain shared understanding, oftentimes that shared understanding becomes inconsistent across people and departments in a way that is confusing, right? Like, it's like we're manufacturing this uncertainty by the way that we measure or by the way that we work. And that problem space is enormous. Harvard Business Review last year had a whole article about how bad data or bad decision-making from inconsistent data represented like $3 billion in possibly stoppable business loss. And that's an enormous, if you said to a VC, well, I've got this $3 trillion potential addressable market, that's a huge problem. And I think that problem right now is a problem for analytics engineers to solve. Okay, I'm so zoomed out right now. And if we want to zoom in, we can see, oh, there are ways that DBT Cloud could start to solve that. And okay, so what's an example? You might imagine something like we could surface some kind of a modal or a piece of tooling that would say, you're using the term conversions in 8 different places. And here's where it is in the DAG. And you're like, oh, geez, like I'm defining this in 6 different ways. No wonder people don't know what I mean when I use this word. That's the kind of thing that DBT, especially coupled with metadata and the observability that the DAG represents, is pretty poised, I think, to make a meaningful contribution to that problem.
I'd actually like to jump in really quick and just ask, since we are talking about the wish list here, besides bringing in the DAG, what are our other plans for bringing documentation closer to the IDE?
So a little bit depends what you mean by docs, right? That is, like, we have documentation generated by a DBT project, of course. And we also have this really big collection of support documentation, like your classic engineering documentation, like where you go to learn how pieces fit with one another. I'd say that my, I think, biggest inspiration for bringing documentation closer to the IDE is how Looker manages. It's like a contextual informational sidebar. I would really like to take that and take it to the next level. by which I mean, how to, like DBT is not, it's complicated. Like it's complicated, but it's not super complicated. There are times where it's like pretty easy to predict like what someone's going to do. If you type ref, like there's only so many possible things that you could type next, right? Like you actually documentation isn't what's needed there. Some smarter autocomplete, a better sense of bringing the sense of the project into the work experience, I think is the win there. I would really love to have a tighter integration between the sort of experience of the DBT generated documentation and the work of the analytics engineer. Like that, I think is a real opportunity to synergy is I think a real opportunity to like take a crack at this uncertainty piece, because you could surface like, oh, in another model you've defined something like this, or you've defined like this exact same source of information in this way. You want to do that again, just surfacing what those consistencies or inconsistencies might look like, maybe making it easier for the frontline analytics engineer to be cognizant of and thoughtful of how their work is going to be surfaced to the broader organization. Something like that, which is, of course, I think maybe the opposite of what people think about when they think about integrating the IDE with documentation. I think the natural thought is like, oh, how do I get all of the possible arguments for this in my workspace? I think that's true. That's a valuable thing to do. But I think the sort of thinking about it in the other direction is also really valuable and takes a crack at that much bigger organizational problem. Maybe that answered the question. I'm not totally sure.
I mean, it helps in the sense that we're getting a picture of the direction, because so just for context, I come from a software engineering background of sorts. And when I think of an IDE, I think of a very standard set of expected pieces of functionality. But in this context, analytics engineering, we're adapting software engineering practices. So it's interesting to see our approach of how we're adapting, say, IDE documentation into this context. So happy for you to go and elaborate on that, just trying to help paint a picture for folks.
Yeah, I think there is so much for us to learn and to continue to co-opt or imitate from software engineering best practices. I think DevOps, DevSecOps, all as far down that road as you want to go. I think there's a lot of stuff to learn from all of those and a lot of things that we can really easily win. But I think it's also like worth noting when you're writing, if you're a software engineer, most of what you're doing is so abstracted from the end user that the actual code itself, I think like trying to document that. If my Spotify is not working, being able to look at what I don't even know what it's written in like Python looks like wouldn't be helpful for me. But it is interesting to think about how the code that analytics engineers write can generate helpful documentation for the people who are experiencing kind of the output of that code. Yeah. So I think there's a ton to learn, and we should continue to take inspiration. We should continue to take inspiration from DevOps, DevSecOps, and general software engineering practices. But I think it's also worth noting when we ought to think about what departures are going to look like, how we can serve purposes that maybe software engineering doesn't need to think about, which is to say, I don't think like pure copy paste, it'll get us to the optimum outcome is my sense.
So in helping folks understand and understanding the context, just can you quickly give us a roadmap of the kind of and when I say roadmap, I don't mean it's feature specific, but at least just a direction of where we're trying to expand functionality, because I think that'll help frame this discussion and help folks ask, better questions, or at least understand what their wish list should look like.
Sure. So in a kind of short-term, like really tangible way, something that I think we have a lot of opportunity, and that is, I think, going to be really cool and like a really interesting differentiating feature, is really leaning into the DAG as a better cognitive map of a DBT project, which is to say, right now, like we give a map, right? We give a map of the project in the IDE, and that is like the file tree. And the file tree is a perfectly precise description of the project, but it isn't actually like cognitively that accessible. And it doesn't in any way actually meaningfully provide a map of like how the project is working or how it ought to be working. This is a metaphor. Metaphors shape our world. Like when people say a perfectly precise map is perfectly useless, right? Y'all have probably heard this saying, the map is not the territory. The file tree is the territory. It's literally like a perfectly precise description of what the project looks like. But in some ways, it's actually so precise as to not be that helpful. Whereas I think we can start to think about the DAG not just as like a directed acyclic graph. We can think of it in that way, but I think we can also think of it as a way of understanding the project more broadly, which is to say, one of the visions that I have is, if any of y'all have ever played SimCity, like you can put an overlay over your city to see like where your fire coverage is, or like where, oh, these people don't have like very powerful electricity. If you run out of a power plant, like these areas are going to experience blackouts. I would love to imagine some kind of an overlay system like that over the DAG. You could set things like testing SLAs and you could observe, oh, like all of our finance, all of the parts that feed our finance exposures are under tested. That's a problem. Or you can imagine someone, you could also meaningfully start to understand, you could understand your models on like a per model optimization. Okay, we're going to feed in some information from Snowflake. We're going to feed in some information from our data warehouse, and we're going to observe which models are costing us the most money. And then you're going to say, okay, we're going to put 3 analytics engineers on this. We're going to slash how much we're paying for our data transformation. We're going to pay for DBT for the next 10 years. That's the kind of thing that I think is a really powerful kind of future. More in a much more like intangible way, I really just want the IDE to be like faster.
Sure.
Like
Of course.
So I want it to be so fast, and I want it to be like unbreakable. And I just can't express like how important that is to me. But it's also like the lead, like it's something like staging. If I get up with my slides and I'm like, there's absolutely nothing new to talk to you about, but like stuff's not as broken and things are a lot faster. Like I actually would really like that, because I think at the end of the day, like we've got to be able, the tooling has got to be able to operate at like the speed at which someone is thinking about the problem, right? Like it's got to be responsive. I want the tool to be something that is like a huge differentiator and not something that like slows people down or becomes like an obstacle to flow state. Gosh, it's like that's just so front of mind for me, but it ends up being like a really hairy problem, because it turns out that there's so many things wrapped up in one another, especially if you're thinking about like a cloud, like a browser-based IDE. It's got to interact with Git. It's got to interact with third-party data warehouses. Often CI/CD is going to represent a piece of that puzzle too. So it ends up being really like hairy, but it's the kind of thing that as it gets better, it gets like exponentially better.
Sure.
Like if something takes 9 seconds and you reduce it to 1 second, like suddenly that's a huge part of your day. It's like much easier and much snappier.
To hit more specific things, we've got Calvin here saying that when we've got the IDE running tests, would like to be able to see filtering by all, by warnings, by failures. Is that something that we're interested in delivering?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been working on, that we're working on internally, and it's hard to suss this out from more direct things, is like working much more closely with the core team to make the DBT IDE, like the cloud IDE, like the best place in the whole world to write DBT code and engage in DBT development. And part of that means as like core focuses on tests and improved testing experience, like we want to reflect that kind of in the cloud. And if these are problems, yeah, we can definitely take a look at them and we can start to try to solve them. Like I want it to be very easy to get the signal from the noise, and like cloud is really
exactly
the place to do that. Yeah, I have an appetite for that for sure.
And what about the second one? What about sorting by models instead of by testing?
I think, yeah, that's there. That's a matter of like just displaying it in a different way. I have an appetite for making it easier to parse that sort of thing. And a little bit like we're going to have to, if we want to take a crack at visualizing that kind of thing in the DAG anyway, right? Like we're going to, like the sort of prerequisite is like understand by model before you can apply visualization to a model-based DAG. Yeah, I think the future of like testing is really bright. And that means that the future of like more sophisticated tooling around testing is quite bright as well. That's my hope.
Fantastic. This is such a great question. I don't want to read it. Dr. Ernie, would you mind unmuting and getting in on this conversation and just throwing out your question? Because this is fantastic.
All right, thank you. Just as I'm not really an analytics engineer, I'm a general purpose IT guy, which is half our IT team. And the biggest problem in my life is disjoint ontologies, right? The different business people use the exact same word to mean different things and different words to mean the same thing. And so what I'm really excited about with DBT is the possibility of pulling everything into one place and creating a standard ontology where we define what words mean. And we do that, I think, by like the way we map these tables. And the question was, is it possible or conceivable that we could take all these implicit redefinitions we're doing in our models and turn them into some sort of explicit glossary for business users, where they say, okay, in this report, this means this and this. And so rather than manually having to maintain some text document, we can start using all the provenance and the history and the remapping of DBT to generate some sort of corporate dictionary of what these words actually mean, which would eliminate about 2/3 of my meetings.
Ernie, I just want to tell you, I feel your pain. Like I'm actually going to share an article that has got me really fired up. I'm going to share it here in Slack, and it's this idea of, I don't know, I don't love the terminology, but they call it headless BI, which is the idea that you should start with the terms. You should start with the business terms and then work from there. You can be like, look, we're an organization. As an organization, we want to know about conversions. And that's where you start. And then you build backwards from there. And you're like, this is what it means every time anybody says it. As opposed to today, when we typically work from the other direction, which is, okay, we've got this data warehouse. Marketing, what do you need to know about? Okay, we're going to make that for you. All right, finance, what do you need to know about? Okay, here you go. Here's what that looks like. And so much of that becomes this like ad hoc. Oh, we lost him. It's okay. I'll keep talking.
It's recorded. I'll make sure to pass it, but please continue.
And that's the solution to the problem. No, I'm just joking. You didn't miss it. Yeah, no, this is like such a problem. And it is this like organizational uncertainty. And it's really frustrating, especially when I think it's a really common experience for people who are working in data, especially in organizations that are just getting started in the modern data stack. For one data person to be sitting in the room and marketing is saying, oh, we've got these numbers say X and Y. And then finance is in the same room. And they were like, we have numbers that use the same language and it says A and B. And then everybody like looks at you and it's, oh, wow, this is a problem. And it's actually y'all's problem, but now it's feeling like maybe it's my problem. And it is, it's real, it's big and it's uncertain. And I think it's causing like real like problems within a lot of these organizations. And I do think that solving this particular problem, like this very, I'm going to say it's very common, not to downplay it or invalidate it in any way, but just to say like, this is very widespread.
Endemic, I think, is the word you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. I think that's right. And the thing is, it's frustrating for everyone in that room, right? No, like nobody else in that room is like, oh, I'm super glad that we're making, this noise, subscribers, and it's inconsistent from the way everybody else is using it. Nobody, like, this is nobody's desired end goal. And I do think that DBT is in a unique position to help organizations start to manage that. And I think some part of that is going to crop out of, are you familiar with like the idea of the exposures node, which like observes parts of the DAG and then provides information from like the outside world, like back into DBT? I think that's the start of it. You might even think of that as, gosh, I'm not coining a term. You might even think of that as like reverse metadata in a sense. Like we're actually like taking data that DBT has no concept of and we're like inserting it in. And I think maybe that is going to be the entry point to this kind of solution space, is like, how do we say to DBT, this is the language that my organization is using that I need to like, that we need to get consistent with.
I'm totally going to blame you for the phrase reverse metadata because I'm going to be using it all over the place.
No, please don't. Oh my gosh, I'm going to have to quit Twitter.
Analytics cannot take responsibility for the terms said there.
Yeah, these opinions are my own. My employer does not necessarily agree to disagree. But yeah, real problem, something I'm thinking about a lot. And I think especially as we start to see like these bigger and bigger organizations start to use DBT and really put it through its paces at the 100, 200, 300 analyst level, like these are the types of problems that are going to really become like really visible and painful in a way that is going to make it easier to prioritize them on the product roadmap.
So the other term that you can use in this context that I've been using is organizational therapy. Because basically you have all these dissociated personalities within the corporation, and you have to get them to make peace with each other and integrate into a coherent self. So
that's right. I like that.
Yeah, and then after we solve that for the corporation, we can do it for government and society. But let's start here.
Ernie, I'm ready to write a check, man. You tell them when. Let's do it. That sounds great.
And breaks the internet for more examples of how that works.
Yeah, it's a real problem, and it's frustrating because it is manufactured, right? It's like this uncertainty doesn't just exist in the world. Like it's a result of our decisions, which of course makes it hard because then it's almost like a form of organizational debt because so much of it is the result of somebody like answering a question at some point. And a little bit like organizations, I think, that start to move to the modern data stack resolve a little bit of this just by nature of moving to better, more software engineering like practices rather than, oh, here's a SQL query, save it on your computer and just put it in this box and run it. And just change this line whenever you want to know something different, whenever you want a different date range. And then you've got like a different version of that file, like floating around for different folks. And getting away from that kind of practice, I think, is going to help people already. But then the second order question, of course, is like, how do we automate this? How do we like make it so that you don't have to go looking for these situations, but instead some part of the project like surfaces when it's happening or when the opportunity for it to occur is happening. Going from reactive to proactive. Yeah, I think there's a giant space for that, and it would make people's lives a lot better.
I just want to jump in. We've only got a couple minutes here left before we all jump over. So if anyone has a last minute question, just want to make sure you get an opportunity to throw it in there. No worries if you don't, but it's really important to us that folks get comments or questions out. This is why we have these. We try to stay close to the community.
I don't know if Calvin's there, but he left a comment in our Slack about changes that he would love to see in the IDE when running tests, and I think Jeff jumped in.
We chatted about those a little bit ago. What I will say though too is that I think that I need to improve the DBT Slack so that there's a way that people can get these things out sooner, because it's great that we're getting thoughts out there, but I think we have, hashtag DBT suggestions. Like that is the place that like at any time you should come into the Slack and just be like, yo, let's talk about X. Because half the time what I do is go talk to the product team and relay timeline stuff back to the community. So just wanted to plug that.
Just a comment, you just want to affirm, Simon, you're talking about the staying in the flow in the IDE. And I personally tend to work locally on VS Code instead of in the IDE for the most part. And as we've been here, we're trying to like, why is that? And it seems like it is just the speed, and it just everything. I can't nail down any particular thing, but everything just takes a little bit longer than I would do it locally, and that adds up over time. And it just has gotten me not to use it. But I want to think more concretely about what that is, but just please keep going down that road. I think that's a great approach. So
I appreciate that. And I think it's also, speed is just so much its own, like to be a fast and snappy experience, like is just such a feature. I think performance is a feature, like stability is a feature. And I'm stuck in this kind of funny spot where I love that people develop DBT locally. Like, of course they do. Like that's desirable. And a little bit like some part of me, like my like warrior's heart, or my like competitive heart is, I got to win them. Like I want people who are developing locally to wish they were on the cloud. But on the other hand, it's really what we need to do is create an experience that anybody can use. Like in some part, like I shouldn't try to compete with local development. What I should do is try to make it so that people who maybe have never seen a development environment before get it and can succeed in it. And then we can talk about what that moment where they maybe decide to go local looks like. How do we make the superpowers of cloud like something that you can extend to in the local environment, right? That's the longer term journey. But yeah, like it seems so simple, but like it's got to be faster. It's got to be faster.
Cool. We're going to close out the main session back on Crowdcast.
Thanks, y'all. I'm on DBT Slack. Get at me if you have anything else you want to talk about. Always happy to chat. All right. Bye.